Alright, let's see if I can resummon some of the things that I've been thinking about a few days ago. I was thinking about the ego and sort of what is meant by the ego. And I think the ego sort of gets a bad rap because we usually define it with all the characteristics that we find negative about the ego, how the ego gets in the way of clarity, where we have some identification with our concept of self that is a barrier to having clarity and an accurate an ability to hear what other people say without a filter of our ego blocking it, because we feel insecure within ourselves because what is said threatens our ego, or where we have assumptions that we make based on an incorrect assessment of ourself that is difficult to alter because our sense of self is hinged incorrectly on an identification of ourselves that does not belong there. And so that's one that's that is the my summary of what is the reason that the ego gets a bad rap, is because the way we define it is it's something that stands in the way of clarity, essentially. I think it comes down to that the simplest way of putting it is the ego gets in the way of seeing things as they are, and because of the sense of self that is threatened, if we see them as they are, then somehow our self is annihilated. And so, but the ego, what the ego really is, it's not so much the way it expresses itself, is not so much it becomes problematic when it acquires inaccurate information and it's used to shield itself from a threat that doesn't really exist. But what the ego really is, it's like a container. It's like a container of identifications. So it's a very interesting thing. It's like a container that we, throughout our lifetimes, we fill with things that we identify with as part of ourself. And it's the container that we use to define this instinct for this I-ness. And so it's almost like the ego itself is like an empty vessel. And so the problem is not the ego itself, but it's what the vessel is holding. So the ego is this instinct for I-ness, which is an emptiness. An emptiness, it's like a void that wants to be filled with something, because it has a sense, there's a sense of there is something here that is hard to define. And so what we do through our lifetimes is in order to define this I-ness, we begin to identify what it is by what it isn't. And so the ego, the sense of I-ness, is because it's hard to define the self. We tend to define ourselves by what we are not. It's like, you are not me. And the ego has this, and what we do as humans is we try to dissect the self into a smaller and smaller components. I think that's part of why in science we try to dissect something in order to understand it all the way down into the tiniest place where it can no longer be dissected, in order to understand the building blocks of how it functions. And so what is interesting about the self is sort of something that is very difficult to touch, because it's more of something that exists like this observer in the background, and there's this urge. It's an urge, it's a feeling. And so what the ego does throughout its lifetime, it seems like we expand our sense of self by filling this container. But what we're actually doing is making ourselves more narrow, and the more we fill this container, ironically, the more full it is with things and objects that we identify with, the more narrow our sense of self becomes. So it's like we're slicing our sense of self up into tinier and tinier parts until we have like the tiniest fragment, and we say, this is who I am. I am this tiny speck, and everything around me, all this ego language that we've put into this container, that's all stuff that we are not. And so in order to understand who we are, we have to carry this gigantic bag of things inside of our ego, of things that we are not. And so this interferes with us being present with things as they really are. Because things as they really are not definable by what they are not. Things as they are not definable by what they are not. The idea of opposites, that's a concept that is actually a fiction created by humanity for whatever purpose. You could say there's some practical reasons to use opposites to give someone a sense of where their location is. I am not on the North Pole, I am on the South Pole, so I am on opposite to the South Pole. So it's very hard for us to conceptualize, it seems, where we are without describing our environment. And our environment is what we call not self. And so our self is like this thing that is moving through this environment, but we have a really hard time when we really like look at what the self is. So what is this thing that is moving through the environment? Is there really a thing that is moving through the environment? Because in order for there to be a thing moving in through the environment, we have to say, well, what is that self that is moving through the environment, and where is that self? That self is kind of like, it's like the air that we breathe. It can't really be seen. And so we have this instinct of I-ness that we then fill with this container, and the container becomes filled with identifications that are actually not self. They're more descriptive of what the self is not than what the self actually is. You could say you're a doctor, but you're not. That's not what the self is. That's like what the self is doing. That's a profession. That's not the self. But we attach these identities to the self as if the self is something that is not good enough without some attachment to it to boost it. But the reality is the self is more real than the identification of the self by something external, like I am a doctor. What is better? This primordial self that has existed since the beginning of time, or something that we invented in the in short amount of time that human beings have existed on this planet, and some profession, something trivial like what we did during one lifetime. And it seems like the things that we put into this ego basket are often things that we try to attach to the self in order to take shortcuts to in order to bypass other people's self. Because as soon as we see ourselves in a position higher than, and somebody else is lower than, now we don't have to respect that self. That self is a lesser self. My self is better. I am an important doctor. I am an important lawyer. I'm a judge. I am a police officer. I am a psychologist. I am a pharmacist. I'm some kind of important person. I'm a senator. I'm a president. I am an important diplomat, representative of my country. And so it seems like a lot of these identifications that we put into this ego basket become reasons for us to see ourselves as separate of everyone who is not a doctor is now in some other place. Everyone who's not a president is some more insignificant self that I don't have to pay attention to. And so it's like this way of artificially separating ourselves through language, essentially, because what it comes down to is the only thing that makes a president is because we use language to honor this notion. But it's really just a notion, and it's a game, it's a collective game with language that we all agree that you get to play the president now. But are you really? Is that self who is a president really a president? No. That self is still fundamentally, whatever self it is, it's not defined by that language game. And so, yeah, what I think is interesting about this idea of how we define ourselves is that we often define ourselves by what we are not. And so we choose an identity that makes us special as compared to others, so that we, not so much that we, not just for the joy of being that thing, but so that we don't have to suffer the pain of being some kind of peasant, some kind of like lesser than identity. So it's like an inflated sense of self that doesn't really have a real foundation. So it's interesting how we have this instinct for dissecting things into smaller and smaller and smaller components in order to identify them as they are. Because we have this need for identification through separation. And so the ego that I think people define as problematic is not so much the ego, because the ego itself is like this container that carries these, for better or for worse, identifications of what the self is and what the self isn't. And rarely do we define the self by what is. So the ego is more like an instinct that is not inherently what we end up defining the ego to be. It's an instinct for this I-ness, and we're always looking for this I-ness, me-ness, separateness. And underneath that, on top of this, underneath this container of I-ness, there is, in the silence, there is this isness. And the isness, which is a funny word, the isness is quietly observing without conclusion, because it doesn't need to conclude anything, because it's simply observing what is. So the second that we begin to talk about what is seen, now we are taken away from the present moment of observing reality as it is. And now we're in a story about what is. And a story about what is always going to be not quite factual. It's not going to be factual because it's a second hand. It's a second-hand filter. Not only, and the problem with that is not only is it not accurate, but it also is not what happens is when we are contemplating what is, we're not seeing what actually is. So we're taking out of the present moment. We're taking a step back. We're trying to explain it, and now we're missing something else that is happening in the meantime, because we can't really put this movie on pause. It just keeps going. The show keeps going, whether we blind ourselves to reality or not. And so when we're in our minds thinking about things and going through our thought loops, we're not present with reality. And that's where suffering begins. It's in this place of taking ourselves into the separateness where we begin to suffer. Because the suffering is more in the story than the actual sensation that is experienced within the body. And it's an identification with something as a negative. It's an identification of this pain is it hurts, therefore it is bad. But what is pain and what hurts and what is bad? These are all descriptive of an experience that is perhaps an intense experience, but the experience in itself, when it's without a story behind it, is more there is no actual pain in it, because the pain comes from this cognitization. I'm going to say that's a word. Cognitization of what it means to have pain, and it's something that is less than desirable. And so often what we do in order to escape pain is we create pain. We create pain so that we can take note of that it is something negative to get away from. And so a lot of illnesses that we have, mental or physical, remain poorly treated because we're not able to be present enough with the sensations, because the sensations are not merely an accident. They're there for a reason. And the reason they're there is for us to be present with them, to be paying attention to them, so that we can get direct perception about the experience to inform a correct action, a correct treatment. And so often what we do is we skip the paying attention to the sensation process, and we go off into some notion, and then we outsource it to some expert, and then we put our entire faith into some expert who might prescribe us something that is going to damage us further, because he or they are not as going to be as in contact with the direct experience. So people who are not afraid to look at their pain and to be present with it, these people, by my estimation, have far better ability to find the right remedies for the things that they suffer, because they are not using pain as an excuse for escapism. And our society has pain labeled as such a bad thing, and as an excuse to do all kinds of it used to be recreational drugs were something that people did to escape, and people saw it as a problem. But now we have a pharmaceutical industry that encourages this escapism sort of behavior that, oh yeah, you can just bypass your anxiety or depression. You don't have to pay attention to any of that. We have the magic pills that will solve your problems, and you can remain unconscious and remain in your state of somnambulism. And the problem is not that you're not paying attention to your body and to your real needs and to being present. The problem is that you have some kind of mental disorder that is like not curable without invasive treatment. Anyhow, I got off track here a little bit, but yeah, so I've covered several things, but the main thing that I thought was that I wanted to reiterate upon here is this: the idea of the ego is not necessarily what we think it is. The ego is more of an instinct to gather information, and then it's not the information that's necessarily problematic. It's the way we interpret that information. So anyhow, I think I'll leave it here. Have a good one.